Welcome to Salon Talks. I am Mary Elizabeth Williams, and this is Zosia Mamet. She is an actor, a singer-songwriter, and a writer. You recognize her from a million things, including, of course, her indelible role as Shoshana on Girls, as Annie on The Flight Attendant from Mad Men, Kimmy Schmidt, the other two, Dickinson, loved your turn on Dickinson, loved Dickinson, and so many other television shows and films. Now, she is the editor of and a contributor to My First Popsicle, an anthology of food and feelings featuring essays and recipes from, oh my God, what a dream team. Patti Smith, Kaylee Cuoco, Ruth Reichel, Katie Holmes, Ted Danson, a million more people who you want to know what they have to say about food. It is an intimate exploration of food and emotion, and I loved it. Hi.
Hi.
It's such a fun book, and it's such a deep book. And I want to ask you about this because uh you see this bright, beautiful, cheerful cover. It's called My First Popsicle. I'm going to ask you, I know you've told the story before, but I want to ask you about the origin of it. But then I also want to ask you, because this book does go in directions that I did not expect it to go. Food is not always a light, easy breezy journey, right?
Yeah, definitely not. And, I had hoped that we would capture that in the through line of this book, but I gave the contributors the loosest leash that I possibly could. I basically said, food and feelings, write about whatever you want to. And I had an inkling and a hope that they would come back with these sort of like exceptionally nuanced and varied essays. And they did. We have such a spectrum, all the way from Tony Hill writing about his love of chain restaurants to Rosie Perez talking about her very intense childhood trauma. And I think it really shows that we all have these connections and these emotional relationships and memories with food. And some of them are really good, and some of them are really traumatic, and some of them are triggering, and some of them are joyful. And that's really what I wanted to get across with this book.
And I have to ask about the origin of it, because the origin is kind of all of that. The
Yeah.
first popsicle, it's not your first popsicle, which I'm sure you get people asking a lot. It's somebody else's first popsicle, and it really is kind of an emotional journey for that particular person.
Yeah, so it was our friend's toddler. We it was now a couple of years ago. It was pre-pandemic. My husband and I were having dinner with some friends, and they were late to dinner, and they showed up and they were so apologetic, and they explained that they had given their son a popsicle for the first time, and they had to stay to watch his reaction because they didn't really expect it to be so extreme. They were thinking like, oh, we're giving our toddler a popsicle, he's going to love it, which he inevitably did. But before he gets to that conclusion, he experiences a myriad of emotions, and they had gotten it on film. And so they showed us this like 2-minute video of their son having a popsicle for the first time. And it so struck me because he is sort of confused at first, and then he seems to not like it because it's very cold. And then he gets very into it, perhaps too into it, and he gets a brain freeze, and then he starts to cry, but then he's like, I want more. And that was sort of like the first seed that planted in my brain about this idea of our emotional connection to food.
Yeah, and it reminds me, I mean, maybe you know this because somebody else in the book references Lori Colin, but there's a Lori Colin essay like that too, where she talks about the expression on her child's face eating
Mm-hmm.
squash the first time, and what an absolutely like magnificent vision that is to see someone eating squash for the first time. It's a really priceless and intimate thing, and this book is full of those moments. You have such an all-star lineup, and you also have people not just from the world of acting, but from writing, from the food world, from music, all over the place. I want to know, because I heard obviously there are people that it makes sense that someone like Kelly Cuoco is in this book, but there are other people in this book. I heard that you actually like cold contacted some people that you wanted for it, that you
Oh,
had emailed a couple of people.
yeah, there were a couple of people who I didn't know personally, or I didn't necessarily have like an easy access connection to, but I was just such an admirer of their work in whatever field they were, technically employed in. And I just really hoped that they would consider contributing. And everybody that I cold emailed said yes, which was so crazy and amazing.
That is wild. And I want to ask you a little bit about that because for those of us who are approaching anything in life where we feel scared to ask someone, this is a book about food and emotions, but it's also about those connections. It's so much about reaching out and making connection. When you were doing that, because you've done this with other projects in your life too, where you have put it out to the world, this is what I want to do. How do you do that, Zasha? Because it can be really scary to ask strangers to do something.
I mean, this sounds sort of like reductive, and I don't mean it that way, but I think you kind of just do it, and I think something that I have to remind myself of a lot, but I think is the most important is like, what's the worst thing that can happen? And like the worst thing that can happen is someone says no. And I guess where my horrible imagination goes beyond that is like, well, really, what's the worst thing that can happen? It's like someone would be offended or someone would like never want to speak to you again. But like, especially if you're cold emailing someone, you already don't know them. And if they get offended, then you probably don't want to work with that person anyways. Cause like, what a bizarre reaction, you know? So I always, whenever I'm afraid to do something like that, I just think like, as long as I come to and ask with like I guess gratitude and an open heart. And I normally when I'm asking someone to do something, it's because they're someone that I admire. And I feel like I mean I complimented a woman the other day. I was leaving a yoga class and I was like, your yoga leggings, your leggings are so cool. And she was like, thank you so much. And we started talking about it. She's like, my husband always says, what woman doesn't like a compliment? And I think that it's like that for every human being, but sometimes we get so afraid and we turn in on ourselves and we start to think like, well, how is this person going to react to my ask? And like most people are just in their own worlds and they're not necessarily thinking about you. And I think as self-centered individuals, as human beings, we often forget that. But I feel like no human doesn't like being complimented and being asked to like take part in something because someone admires them. So yeah, I think you kind of just got to do it. And it's like, remind yourself the worst that can happen is they say no.
And as you point out in the introduction, food is a common denominator for all of us. We all have such specific and unique experiences with it and relationships with it, as this book shows, but we all have a story to tell about. We have more than one story. And I really appreciated the way that you set us up in the introduction. You talk about your own experiences. You talk about the fact that this book is going to take on some heavy things, that there are going to be discussions about eating disorders, about mental health. That's tough to look at. I want to ask how you wanted to set that up, set the tone in this book so that there was space in it for these kind of harder conversations, knowing that that can be difficult for people to read about. Or do you feel like maybe writing and reading is a safer space for people to explore those things?
I really wanted this book to be a home for any kind of story that the contributor wanted to tell. And I really wanted it to show, like I said before, the spectrum of these emotional connections that we all have to food, that like, it's good and bad and everything in between. And so that's why I didn't lead anybody in terms of like a subset subject matter. I really just wanted them to have free reign to write about whatever called to them. And I knew that people were going to write funny stories and silly stories. And I had hoped that people would go to these sort of darker, deeper places, and they absolutely did. And so I really wanted to create the space. And I went a bit back and forth with my editors about whether or not we should have essentially a trigger warning at the beginning of the book. And we inevitably decided that we wanted to have that because it was actually one of the hardest parts of the book to write because I really wanted to set it up in a way that I never wanted to deter anybody from reading these essays. I just wanted to make them aware that they were there, so no one was caught off guard if a subject matter was going to be triggering for them. But, it's interesting. I talked about Rosie's piece before, and it deals with some very heavy topics. And we had a talk the other night about the book, and she was on a panel with me, and she was talking about writing it. And she was like, writing that story wasn't necessarily cathartic, and talking about it isn't necessarily cathartic, but I know that I have to in order to heal, essentially. And I think writing and reading about things that may be triggering for individuals is kind of necessary, as someone who has survived something quite traumatic in my younger years. Like, if you put something in a drawer deep down inside, it's never going to get better. And so, yeah, I definitely thought it was really important to make space for people to tell those kinds of stories in this book.
Yeah, and that's honestly, that's one of my favorite essays in the book. And then she generously includes this lengthy, complicated, beautiful recipe at the end of it as well. It's such an incredible set piece in this book, as are so many. But then you also have like Jello cake. It's all over the place. It's like,
Uh-huh.
it's like, and I love that too, because there's no high low in this book at all. It's just everything. It's like it's Jello cake, it's SpaghettiOs, it's really sophisticated restaurant food. So I want to know, have you made any of the dishes from the book since?
I haven't had time to make any of the dishes yet, but I'm pretty excited. I had sort of a bucket list moment earlier today. I was at the Today Show and Martha Stewart was on right before me, and we were in the green room together. And yeah, she picked up, Martha Stewart was holding my book, and I was like, cool, I can die now. And she asked me the same question, and I was like, I haven't made any of them. And she kind of gave me a discerning look, and I was like, don't worry, I will.
Oh my God, you got to like Martha touched your book. Martha was holding your
Martha touched my book.
oh my God. Okay, yeah, that's day over. I can't believe you
Day
even
over,
talk
day done.
about it after something like that. I would just go to bed and like call it quits for the day after something.
Totally.
Sasha, that's amazing. Okay, so and you haven't cooked anything from the book, but I do know based on the things I've seen from YouTube, but you do like to entertain. You have this really, really cool house. When people come over, what do you like to serve them? You talk a lot about how your love language is like gifts, and I assume that also means giving people food. What do you like to feed people?
Um, I mean, like anything and everything. I'm totally the one who I live in fear of there not being enough food. So I'm always the person who's like making way too much. But I'm a big believer in snacks. So I'm a big believer in you never want to eat on an empty stomach. So people come over and there's like a cheese plate with like nuts and apples and 17 different types of crackers. And like I always want to have options for everyone. So normally like that's what's out first. And then my husband likes to call me a rustic cook, which I think is like a very kind euphemism for just like not actually that good. I'm 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 an okay cook,
It's about
but
the presentation. That's what I think the word
I'm
rustic
not
means.
great at presentation either though. Like I kind of am just like it's all going to the same place. Like let's I don't know. But I like a simple meal. So, we had some friends over the other night and I made an epic taco spread. So like that's a pretty classic meal that I'll serve people. Um, I like something just like kind of simple and hearty that I feel like no one has to feel like polite eating. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's tacos, right? You don't have to worry that you
Oh,
you you didn't read the right book to eat the
you get
tacos.
to eat with your hands. Who doesn't love that?
Tell me what you're working on now, because you are like acting. You've got a movie coming. You're working on a movie right now, right?
I shot two movies this summer and like into September.
And then you allegedly, I hear, have another book coming out that you're working on.
Working on a book of personal essays that will be coming out next after this one.
So a different kind of, is there a theme? Is there a,
Um, just I think it's just I'm sort of the through line that they happen to all be coming out of my brain. But yeah, it's a book of nonfiction essays that come from up here.
what about the music?
I haven't made music for quite some time. Like my as I say, my day job kind of like got in the way.
It's been a lot has been keeping you busy. So I have to ask one last question because you end the book with Christmas. You end the book talking about how much you love the season and your bittersweet memories tied to this particular item of food. I want to know now that we're getting into the season, what are you excited to eat this season or to make this season, Sasha?
I love Christmas so much. And I'm a huge baker. I've always loved to bake. I didn't learn to cook until later in life, but baking has been like a joy of mine since I was little. And one of the things I love so much about Christmas are the smells of the season. So I'll like literally anything I can possibly think of that smells like a holiday season, I will start baking probably once this press tour is over. I will go, I mean, pumpkin bread, pies, anything with like a gingery smell to it. My husband's training for a movie right now, so he's going to be very mad at me because I just am going to be like filling the house with baked goods. Um, but yeah, that's like anything and everything baking wise that smells like Christmas.
I love it. You can't get enough of those cinnamony, gingery smells. Yeah. I
Yeah.
love them all year long. I think they're fine even in the summer. Like why limit them to, yeah, 100%. It's always the right time for gingery, pumpkiny smells.
Always.